excuse me, we have two important questions of the Congress to say. Victoria Colas.
Yeah, so the first thing is anyone with a PowerPoint presentation, please send it to Agatha ASAP, okay, so that we have it. And the second question is that the two symposiums are not in the afternoon, they are at 12:30 today, okay, so 12:30, both symposiums, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Claudia.
No problem. Thank you very much, Alicia, for this generous, very, very generous, too generous presentation. I am very glad to be here and very grateful for this, your invitation and this opportunity. When I received the invitation to speak at this Congress, I was very honored, of course. And I wonder what could allow me to connect my current research on generativity and parenthood to the topic of the conference, namely normality, normativity, and the life world, on which I must confess from the outset that I don't really have the strongest or the most direct expertise. And then I immediately realized or remembered that any phenomenological account of the lived experience of parenthood can never be a mere description of what is it like to be a parent, but also discloses, be it tacitly or explicitly, the structural conditions of this experience, be they formal, transcendental, or material, social, historical, cultural, political. For what concerns the latter, abundant research is available nowadays in the social sciences, where concepts like the procreative norm in the Francophone context or repronormativity in the Anglophone context have been developed. Is it possible, I wondered, by discovering all this amount of work, to fill the theoretical and methodological gap that separates sociological and anthropological research on procreative norms and repronormativity and the phenomenological account, be it classical or more contemporary, of parental experiences, choices, and projects? It is my intention today to advance in this direction, and in doing so to put emphasis on the necessity to remake or consolidate anew the alliance between phenomenology and the social sciences in the wake of Alfred Schutz and Merleau-Ponty. When contemporary social sciences speak of procreative norms and repronormativity, their concept of the norm seems to express the multiple and highly variable social cultural rules that govern procreation in an implicit or an explicit manner, and that equally shape and determine discourses and representations, experiences and legal decisions and dispositions. This means that the stance of the social sciences is always, to some extent, a constructivist one. They are intrinsically suspicious of the idea of an intrinsic pre-reflective and pre-discursive sense of experience, an idea which is specific to phenomenology to some extent. One of the best illustrations of such a suspicion remains John Scott's famous 1992 essay, The Evidence of Experience. Scott says the project of making experience visible, be it presented as a phenomenological project or not, renders invisible the historicity of experience and reproduces the very terms and conditions upon which that experience is in fact founded. Endorsing Scott's position, Linda Martin Alcoff writes in her 2018 book, Rape and Resistance, quote, "What we need to do politically is transform experience, not simply reveal it, but a faulty philosophical understanding of the genealogy of experience will block this transformative work." And she continues, quote, "Experience is not pre-theoretical, nor is theory separate or separable from experience, and both are always already political in the sense that they are dependent on a conceptual repertoire that is produced under social conditions in which power relations play an important part." Such claims that have an obvious Foucauldian resonance and illustrate an orientation that corresponds to some extent to that which is called nowadays critical phenomenology are highly convergent in my view with the sociological and anthropological claims on procreative norms and repronormativity, which emanate most often, and perhaps unsurprisingly, from feminist social research and, more recently, from LGBTQ+ scholarship. However, the task remains to show how such norms and normativities inhabit the lived experiences of parenthood, of parental projects and choices, as well as their descriptions, and how, in turn, these descriptions and experiences themselves can be a challenge to these norms and a terrain for elaborating new ones. The political transformation of experience, it would indeed be impossible without challenging the existent dominant norms and creating new ones. Accordingly, it is this constant and complex circulation between experiences, descriptions, and norms that governs them both, norms they endorse or against which they struggle in order to create new ones, that must be explored and that I will attempt to explore today by confronting the phenomenological accounts of generativity, fecundity, or more plainly parenthood, with the sociological and anthropological accounts of procreative norms and repronormativity. For what concerns the former, I will examine some of Husserl's and Levinas's classical analysis and very briefly recall some of their most important feminist critical readings, like Janet Donahoe, Lisa Günther, and Sarah Lachance Adams, without forgetting to say a few words, I hope, about Beauvoir's revolutionary account of the lived experience of motherhood as largely constructed by gender norms. I will then turn to the notion of procreative norm, developed in French sociology and anthropology, demonstrating that the social sciences have taken up perhaps Beauvoir's heritage and her critical reflection on gender norms in a much more important manner than the subsequent French phenomenology. The notion of repronormativity, developed in particular in the field of Anglophone LGBTQ+ studies during the past 2 decades, can equally contribute to unveiling the historical, social, and cultural dimension of parental choices and experiences, and to relaunching the phenomenological debate on the origins and levels of normativity, as well as a somewhat parallel debate on the relevance and the limits of social constructivism. I will start by briefly recalling some of the major delineations of Husserl's account of generativity. The posthumous publication of Husserl's research manuscripts has provided, since the 1970s, significantly new insights into his phenomenology of intersubjectivity, famously outlined in the Cartesian Meditations. In paragraph 61 of the fifth meditation, Husserl mentions indeed the most serious essential problems for a constitutional phenomenology as transcendental philosophy, and puts a peculiar emphasis on the generative problems of birth and death and the generative nexus of psychophysical being, Generationszusammenhang der Animalität in German. Thus, the generative problems are supposed to concern the beginning and the end of subjective life, as it necessarily stands within a historical intersubjective community whose intergenerational structure assigns it with a certain position and function, parental or filial, for instance. But instead of developing further these issues in the meditations, Husserl simply contends that they, quote, belong to a higher dimension and presuppose such a tremendous labor of explication pertaining to the lower spheres that it will be a long time before they can become problems to work on, end of quote. His subsequent research from the 1930s reveals, however, the increasing importance of the generative problems of phenomenology that the published work only stealthily mentions. Thus, the genetic account of transcendental life, which deals with the immanent temporality and self-temporalization, is significantly complemented by the generative one, which insists on the fact that each subjectivity belongs to a generative connection, generativer Zusammenhang, that fashions the peculiarity of both its subjective and its historical life. Generativity chiefly manifests itself to the fact that one is born, which expresses the relational, intersubjective, and even intercorporeal emergence of each subjectivity. This is why, in a research manuscript from the 30s, now published in Husserliana, volume 42, Husserl can raise the questions concerning what is properly meant by procreation, Zeugung, from a monadic or transcendental point of view. The famous Universal Teleology research manuscript from September 1933 convergently deals with procreation, Zeugung, as it is implied in sexual drive, in Husserl's view, and with the drive intentionality, Trieb Intentionalität, as it designates the orientation towards others, an orientation that Husserl considers to be sexual and social at the same time, geschlechtlich sozial. The research field that is thus delineated, Husserl adds at this occasion, comprises the problems relating to parents and above all to mother and child, which also arise in connection with the problematic of copulation. Such issues are undoubtedly even more difficult to tackle nowadays when medically assisted procreation multiplies the forms of parenthood and makes it possible to dissociate genetic motherhood and the gestation on the one hand, and gestation and maternity on the other. Admittedly, Husserl does not distinguish between biological parenthood and social parenthood, no doubt because he sees them as going mostly hand in hand. However, it is important to stress that both forms of parenthood must be considered when dealing with the generative connection of subjectivities, insofar as this connection concerns not only procreation and birth, but also the fact that the child's progressive awakening to consciousness and the development of her orientation towards the world and the others are relational or intersubjective processes themselves. It is true, nonetheless, that Husserl is particularly interested in the mother-child relationship that finds itself built through pregnancy or gestation, as he specifically reflects on the fact that birth is preceded by a prenatal life, an original or primary childhood, Urkindlichkeit, as he says, which already implies a certain kind of intentionality or word possession. And he described this primary original intentionality as instinctive. Furthermore, it is not only the relationship to the world, but also the orientation towards others that Husserl regards as instinctive. In this respect, he repeatedly stresses the significance of what counts for him as the most original intersubjective bond, the child's relationship to the mother, as she often is the most prominent and most present of the first others, the ersten anderen, that a child encounters in her life. Accordingly, Husserl claims that the instinctive relatedness to others that commands the beginning of our intersubjective life originates in the relation to the mother. The child's instinctive orientation toward the mother, or one could add toward the primary caregiver or attachment figure who occupies the maternal position when the genetic, gestational, or social mother herself is absent or has resigned, this instinctive orientation is firstly intertwined with the instinct of nourishment, and with the instinct of objectivation, Husserl says, but progressively develops afterwards into specific feelings, empathy, and furthermore, that which Husserl calls the most original human love, the love for the mother. If Husserl often describes the relationship between mother and child, which he also depicts as the most original genetic continuity, as formed instinctively in an original manner, one has to ask, though, what is the meaning of the instinct in question? Does it remain true to the precept of avoiding the naturalization of transcendental life? Otherwise said, does it completely dismiss a naturalistic understanding of instinct and motherhood? How can we bestow instinct a properly transcendental meaning in this context? Undoubtedly, the fact that the mother will always stand out as the first other toward whom the child is instinctively oriented is also in line with Husserl's traditional, if not patriarchal, vision of the family. This vision is manifest, for instance, in a 1921 research manuscript where the reference to what is natural equally overshadows the historical, social, and cultural, and the transcendental dimension of intersubjective life. The question as to whether the naturalization of intersubjective life is successfully avoided also emerges when Husserl writes, quote, "In the family community that develops in a natural way, we easily see that what comes first is the solicitude, Fürsorge, of the mother for the children, which develops in a natural and naive way," end of quote. More generally and also more optimistically, to quote an even earlier text, Husserl believes that in the relationship between parents and children, we are dealing with, quote, "an original drive to satisfy the needs of others, to alleviate the suffering of others," end of quote. The drives that govern parental behaviors are undoubtedly depicted here in an overly simplistic and insufficiently nuanced manner, in a regrettable indifference to the penetrating insights that history, culture and anthropology, sociology, psychology, or psychoanalysis had already started to provide with respect to them. Such an indifference can also be regretted when Husserl plainly claims that the mother, with her maternal instincts, lives in the child, lebt im Kind. If motherhood is thus undoubtedly idealized in a way that makes it impossible to account for the immense variety and even the radical heterogeneity of maternal conduct, it is also, of course, in order to present it as a vocation and to make it function as an ethical paradigm. This point has been dealt with in an enlightening manner by Janet Donohoe in a 2010 paper, "The Vocation of Motherhood, Husserl and Feminist Ethics." The ethical dimension of the reference to motherhood grounds in a conception of maternal love as absolute and unconditioned, which plays a clearly paradigmatic role in Husserl's late ethics. This ethical dimension of maternal behavior might even have been the very first trigger of Husserl's attention to the mother-child relationship. He mentions it indeed on a sheet inserted in the manuscript of his 1920 lecture Einleitung in die Philosophie, that it is as early as 1907 that Moritz Geiger addressed him with the justified objection that, quote, "it would be ridiculous to ask a mother to consider whether the promotion of her child is the best thing in her practical field," end of quote. At this point of the analysis, the descriptive account of motherhood in Husserl has already started to unveil some of its tacit normative presuppositions. On the one hand, following his understanding of maternal vocation, we are confronted with a remarkable conflation between instinctive behavior and ethical behavior. For Husserl, the maternal figure is meant precisely to embody and illustrate the unexpected continuity between instinctive and affective life on the one hand and ethical life on the other, as the mother is supposed to act out of instinct and love, and not out of reason alone, at least, and is a good mother as such. However, Husserl does not inquire any further into the norms of good motherhood. If in the Crisis of European Sciences, paragraph 55, he connects the problems of generativity, namely, once again, the issues pertaining to birth, death, procreation, and the intergenerational bond, to the problem of the sexes, Problem der Geschlechter, when dealing, a unique mention, one has to say, in his published work, when dealing with motherhood, he never explicitly raises the question of gender roles, be they considered as transcendentally relevant, as biologically determined, or as socially constructive. Of course, it would not be impossible to find in Husserl's phenomenology of intersubjectivity and community the foundations for a more general theory of parenthood, of being a parent, a role shared by both the father and the mother. References to the parents taken together, the Eltern, although rare, are not absent from his writings and also occur very often, as might be expected, in contexts where the generative problems are the issue. But in his exploratory descriptions of maternal experience, the father, or rather the man, der Mann, is most often mentioned only insofar as he is, quote, oriented with his sexual instinct toward the woman and the woman toward him, so that they are both oriented toward the founding of a family. Thus reflecting, I comment, a plainly heteronormative vision of sexuality and family, of course. That is also to say that the lived experience of fatherhood does not really receive any attention, and that in spite of their richness and originality, the phenomenological descriptions of motherhood clearly stand in line with the patriarchal vision of the family. But accordingly, the ethical normativity that commands the maternal posture of care, solicitude, and love can only be in direct tension with the social-cultural normativity that governs gender roles and prescribes women not only a certain conduct and posture, but also a certain social position. Needless to recall here that at the time when Husserl writes, and in the German context of his time, gender roles in general or as parental roles were far from being fluid or interchangeable. Edith Stein's difficulty to obtain her habilitation and Husserl's reluctance to provide her with full support for this stand as a clear proof. Of course, this socio-historical context is supposed to be bracketed through the phenomenological reduction, but the fact that it is bracketed does not mean that his prior effectiveness has been suspended, or that phenomenological reduction can deactivate the way it determines that which appears and lets itself described in the field of a phenomenology of intersubjectivity and generativity. This would still be the case a few decades later, when Levinas writes Totality and Infinity and Otherwise Than Being. As it is well known, the fact of mentioning in Time and the Other the, quote, legitimate claims of feminism did not suffice to protect Levinas from the feminist critique of his essentialization of the feminine as a privileged figure of otherness. In the very introduction of the first volume of The Second Sex, published in 1949, Beauvoir famously writes, quote, I suppose Mr. Levinas is not forgetting that woman also is consciousness for herself. But it is striking that he deliberately adopts a man's point of view, disregarding the reciprocity of the subject and the object. When he writes that woman is mystery, he assumes that she is mystery for the man. So this apparently objective description is in fact an affirmation of masculine privilege. End of quote. It would be difficult to say that Levinas's analysis of parenthood or fecundity in his own terms escapes this critique, as it is equally well known, both in Time and the Other and in Totality and Infinity, Levinas elaborates his account of fecundity based only on one of its possible configurations, namely the father-son relationship. Otherwise said, he does not consider it relevant to present the otherness of the child under the sign of the feminine as a girl. And motherhood, or the parental role itself as feminine, makes only one rapid and ambiguous appearance in Totality and Infinity. Feminist readings of Levinas have not failed to question these choices in the wake of Beauvoir, who, herself, only points out the account of the feminine as alterity and leaves aside the discussion of fecundity and fatherhood, even though the two are closely connected to that of the feminine. It is rather indisputable indeed that the androcentric viewpoint that Beauvoir criticizes in Levinas also dominates his understanding of fecundity in terms of fatherhood and father-son relationship. This viewpoint can even be explicitly found in the late Levinas, even after the publication of Otherwise Than Being. Thus, in a 1985 interview published as an afterword to the German translation of The Humanists of the Other in 1989, one can read this striking statement, quote, what really remains of otherness as a woman is the alteritas of the son. It is in this sense that something remains of this way of being other, that is the feminine gender. Le genre féminin in the French translation. Even without paying specific attention to this peculiar and somewhat marginal passage, several critical readings have questioned Levinas's exclusively masculine version of the parental scenario since Catherine Chalier's 1982 book, Figures du féminin, to the more recent work of Stella Sanford, Sarah Lachance Adams, or François David Sebat. Some of these critical readings ultimately turn into feminist defenses of Levinas, as it is the case for Catherine Chalier herself, as well as more recently for Tina Chanter and Lisa Günther. But such defenses can difficultly dissipate the reluctance and perplexity caused by Levinas's emphasis on the father-son relationship in time and the other and totality and infinity. If sexual or gender difference is so irreducible and fundamental as Levinas himself contends, why not apply it to the child as well? Wouldn't then be a daughter an even more radical figure of otherness for the father? What are the norms that govern experience as well as phenomenological description here and command the exclusion or the subordination of daughters and mothers? In an article published in 2006 in the journal Studia Phenomenologica under the title Levinas, Father, Son, Mother, Daughter, François-David Sebag goes so far as to question the phenomenological nature of Levinas's description of fecundity, as it focuses exclusively on the relationship between father and son. Ultimately, Sebag seems to agree with Beauvoir's objection, considering that, quote, the decision has already been made by Levinas, the subject's point of view is the masculine point of view, and pointing out the paradoxical movement by which father and son seem to mutually generate each other as subjectivities, bypassing the intervention of the maternal feminine. Accordingly, rather than a phenomenological description, Levinas's account appears in François-David Sebag's view as a symbolic description heavily burdened with metaphysical presuppositions. In her 2000 book, The Metaphysics of Love, Gender and Transcendence in Levinas, Stella Sanford identifies this metaphysical horizon with the long-lasting inheritance of the Platonic eros as it intrinsically devaluates the fecundity of feminine bodies. But quite manifestly, the presuppositions that undermine the Voraussetzungslosigkeit of Levinas's description pertain not only to a certain metaphysics, but also to a socio-cultural normativity that assigns clear gender and parental roles to men and women, and which nowadays is particularly oppressive and exclusive towards transgender persons that attempt to endorse parental roles. I will come back to this a bit later, but I would first like to continue my discussion of Levinas by noticing that, compared to the powerful emphasis on the father-son relationship in time and the other and totality and infinity, otherwise than being undoubtedly marks a turning point. Quite surprisingly, indeed, the vocabulary of fecundity and fatherhood disappears entirely, and it is motherhood or maternity defined as bearing par excellence, le porter par excellence in French, that is supposed to embody the ethical stance of responsibility as substitution. Furthermore, while fatherhood was defined in totality and infinity with respect to a time which is absolutely other, an infinite future, and to a realm beyond the possible, which opens up for the father alone, in otherwise than being, motherhood refers to a sensible and embodied posture of closeness, proximity to the child. Thus, one could say, parenthood gets embodied and even materialized, gets finally embodied and even materialized. This is why Levinas can speak of the maternal relations by saying that, quote, matter shows itself in them for the first time in its materiality. This understanding of maternity also highlights a regime of sensibility that had been previously obscured or invisibilized. Levinas speaks of sensible experience as obsession by the other or maternity. But this sensible and embodied maternal stance is not infra-ethical. It serves precisely to show that responsibility for others begins in the very passivity of sensibility, in a way similar or at least parallel to the late Husserl's foundation of ethics in instinct and affectivity. In doing so, however, the asymmetry between fatherhood and motherhood is nonetheless maintained and even reinforced. Fatherhood in totality and infinity never meant substitution for the other, and even less so obsession or persecution by the other, but only self-transcendence beyond the possible and into the infinite future opened up by the child. How can we understand this asymmetry, this irreducible duality of parental stances, and can it be entirely disconnected from patriarchal gender norms and rules? Of course, one has to admit that Levinas is far from considering motherhood as a biological condition. Rather, he resolutely denaturalizes it by identifying it to an ethical stance. But this observation can only relaunch the debate on the metaphorical status of motherhood and on the relationship of this metaphor to empirical motherhood, which has long been reserved to women alone. Does Levinas's denaturalization of motherhood amount to an abusive appropriation of women's reproductive capacity and their erasure as empirical subjects, or is it, on the contrary, a universal injunction to adopt the maternal stance, to be like a maternal body, as some feminist readers of Levinas, like Lisa Günther, have argued? By considering motherhood as an ethical stance rather than as a biological or anthropological situation, Levinas suggests that it is by no means reserved to women or mothers alone. On the contrary, everyone should be able to adopt it and thus become like a maternal body in their responsibility for others. This point is central to Lisa Günther's reading, who offered one of the most convincing feminist defenses of Levinas's approach to motherhood in her 2006 book, The Gift of the Other, Levinas and the Politics of Reproduction. From a feminist perspective, Lisa Günther is well aware of the major risks of describing motherhood as substitution or as the ultimate form of carrying, le porté par excellence of bearing. As she puts it, quote, any simplistic identification of ethics with femininity would carry the risk of perpetuating the patriarchal image of the good mother, who is ethical by default and therefore, in reality, not ethical at all. Nonetheless, Günther attempts to show that in his complementary analysis of fatherhood and motherhood, Levinas introduces his own version of gender trouble and challenges the gender norms of parenthood. Of course, as Lisa Günther insists, Levinas does not limit the injunction to welcome and bear the other like a maternal body to mothers, and he does invite us to distinguish between motherhood as a condition, be it ontological, biological, or social, and motherhood as an ethical practice of welcoming and substitution. However, Levinas does not dwell on the nature of the resistance that this injunction is likely to encounter within patriarchal societies dominated by a civilization of virility. To quote Australian philosopher Jane Limer in her 2016 book, The Phenomenology of Gravidity, Reframing Pregnancy and the Maternal through Merleau-Ponty, Levinas and Derrida, I quote, social structures and hierarchies will foreclose the likelihood of men being able to be like a pregnant woman, not only because they cannot, at least at present, become physically pregnant, but also because their social position in the structures of hospitality as host and sovereign denies or at least obstructs their capacity for vulnerability, passivity, and annul giving, morally coding such subjectivities as cowardly and irresponsible. Not only are men in patriarchal culture socially situated to reject a maternal psychology in preference to the masculinity of entitlement, the quote goes on, modes of maternity are expected of women, reinforced through social structures that ethically code good mothers and good women as vulnerable and passive. End of quote. Otherwise said, in spite of their undisputed potential for interrogating the dominating norms and creating new ones, these phenomenological descriptions of parenthood still have to struggle against the remarkable force of procreative norms which have been socio-culturally instituted and transmitted. From a phenomenological point of view, such norms are more than a social given. They have a history similar to those of cultures and traditions. They have been instituted, sedimented, inherited, and can be repeatedly reactivated. They form a stock of available discourses, representations, habitualities that have been historically, socially, culturally transmitted. And as such, they must be submitted to critique or even deconstructed should they turn out to be unjust or oppressive. As Husserl puts it in a very inspiring research manuscript published in Husserliana, volume 39, I quote, "The fight against tradition, against the supposed self-evidence of life experience, which in truth is no self-donation. It is always and in the full sense a struggle against the situation, against the sedimented acquisition of highly mediated validities of being that have become self-evident." In the last moment of my presentation, I will turn to the question of procreative norms and repronormativity as they are developed nowadays in the social sciences. Undoubtedly, these approaches take us at another level with respect to that of phenomenological description and analysis of generativity on the one hand and normativity on the other. It might be worth asking, however, if the two levels are completely heterogeneous. Also, by confronting these two levels of analysis, one also has to raise the question of the connection between that which appears to be infrapolitical, a lived experience or a lived situation, which is described in its intentional structures, and the political, insofar as, when norms concerning procreation are the issue, reproductive justice is also at stake. According to French sociologists Nathalie Bajot and Michel Ferron, the procreative norms designate the socially defined right conditions, age, type of relationship, professional situation, for having a child in a certain society. The fact that these conditions are socially defined and concern a certain society in particular means, of course, that they are highly likely to vary, both historically and geographically. More precisely, they cannot but vary. The sociological standpoint assumes a strong relativism and is particularly suspicious about any universality claim. Pierre Bourdieu famously voiced this suspicion in his responses to Loïc Vacon, published in 2002, while denouncing the tendency present in phenomenology, but which ethnology manages, in his view, to circumvent, to, I quote, universalize without knowing it a reflection based on the particular case of the phenomenologist's original relationship to his or her own society. The challenge is then double. Is it possible in general to provide a phenomenological analysis or description that avoids a certain essentialization? And is it possible to avoid essentialization otherwise than by embracing a strong relativism in the wake of the social sciences? In any case, one thing is sure, social research helps us phenomenologists realize or remember to what extent procreative norms, like parenting norms themselves, are gender norms. In doing so, it invites us to develop Husserl's seminal attention for the Problem der Geschlechter, so problem of the sexes, very rapidly raised in the Crisis of European Sciences, paragraph 55, into an attention for gendered social roles, such as they find themselves prescribed around procreation and parenting. Gendered parental roles generate not only specific personal or social expectation, but also specific forms of projecting oneself and engaging oneself into the parental experience and adventure, if I may say. At this level, the sociologists Bajot and Ferron note, for instance, in their empirical inquiry that in spite of all discourses and measures that support professional equality between men and women, women still have a tendency to deprioritize their professional investment when it comes to their parental duties. This suggests that the gender division between productive and reproductive work might still not have been entirely reorganized since the time of Husserl and Levinas. Even though mothers have massively invested the sphere, women and mothers have massively invested the sphere of productive work, they are still dominant in the sphere of reproductive work. They are also still preferentially targeted by the scientific advances in child development psychology, as shown, for instance, by attachment theory, and it is under such social and scientifically funded pressure that they still largely confirm that which Husserl displays as an illustration of motherhood as a vocation or as an ethical stance. I quote him, and this is a very quite famous quote. Playing a Mozart sonata, Husserl says, is more beautiful than washing the child, but the latter is a duty when the time is right now. Undoubtedly, writing a phenomenology book also was and still is to some extent more fulfilling than washing, feeding, or comforting a child, but still parental duties did not impose on fathers in the same way. This discrepancy was even sometimes provided with subtle theoretical justification. One can think here of the way Scheller, for instance, considered that fathers lacked the instinctive power of identification with their children that mothers have, and for these reasons he wrote, I quote, "We do not have a Vaterliebe, father love, corresponding to Mutterliebe, mother love. The word Vaterliebe," he claims, actually leaves us in doubt as to whether the father is the loving or the loved one, whereas mother love, Mutterliebe, is absolutely definite in referring to the mother's love for her child. This ineluctable asymmetry of the gendered parental roles is the unavoidable corollary of the always imminent renaturalization of motherhood and of the gender division of work. The normative assignation of women and mothers to reproductive work leaves them little room in common discourses and representation, as well as in phenomenological descriptions, leaves little room for the maternal dilemma or for what Husserl himself depicts elsewhere as a conflict of duties or a conflict of vocation. Procreative norms will also rather legitimate the social pressure to procreate under specific ideal conditions, of course, and delegitimate the personal desire or non-desire of motherhood in spite or because of non-ideal conditions. Therefore, one could consider that here that which Levinas grasped in Time and the Other as the legitimate claims of feminists involves the constant renegotiation of the procreative norm, since it is one of the most fundamental social gender norms and one of the most powerful expressions of contemporary political biopower. The fact that the renegotiation and recomposition of procreative norms is strongly impulsed nowadays by the large diffusion of medically assisted procreation has quite predictably drawn the attention of social scientists. At the beginning of the last decade, French sociologist Virginie Rosé-Gomez led an empirical inquiry on women and couples that search for medical assistance in procreation abroad and interpreted the women's embarrassment with the idea of carrying a baby that doesn't share their genetic material when they had to appeal to an ovocyte donor as a striking proof of the persistent biologization of the experience of motherhood, so strong that even the massive embodied investment of pregnancy was held to be somewhat insufficient in order to fully become a mother or to fully respond to the promotion of blood and genetic transmission tacitly operated by the procreative norm. Social but also juridical or legal research or repronormativity embraces this observation. The naturalization of procreation is much more persistent than that of heterosexuality, for instance. Accordingly, repronormativity designates the established dominant norms that resist the pluralization of norms with respect to procreation and the creation of new norms. But by doing so, dominant norms put all the social pressure of procreation on some people, women mostly, at least when they check certain age and social status conditions, while condemning or even hindering the desire to procreate or the parental projects of others, like trans persons who, until only 1 decade ago, were submitted to compulsory sterilization, even in a country like France, but also women that do not meet the procreative norm because they are considered to be too young or too old, too poor, or not healthy enough, for instance. Since I don't have the time to develop this account of repronormativity, I think I will go directly to my conclusion. I will just say before beginning my conclusion that, of course, with respect to repronormativity, the phenomenologist can very well attempt to bracket these norms before engaging in her account of experience. She cannot deactivate, however, the fact that the effectiveness of this norm has already decided who is likely to have certain experience and who is not. It has decided, for instance, that the mother will wash the child in order to respond to an an absolute oath, while the father will play the Mozart sonata or write the phenomenology book, according to his own vocation that doesn't result from a naturalization of his capacity. These norms have also decided, for instance, that the poor and often racialized woman that both parents employ will rather take care of their children than of her own ones, if she can have any at all. So I now come to my conclusion. I wanted to present the problem of procreative norms as a marginal problem, a rand problem in Husserl's sense, a problem which allows asking how the marge is defined and reinterrogating the norm from the marge. If I chose to complement the phenomenological account on normativity with an emphasis on social normativity, it was in order to show not only how lived experiences are shaped and governed by certain norms that originate in a life form which is a historical, social, political, and cultural one, but also how the symbolic and material effectiveness of norms decides who is entitled to certain experiences and who is not. This is precisely the scope of notions like procreative norms and repronormativity that I discussed today. The last issue that I would like to raise very quickly is how can such notions be integrated into a phenomenological account of normativity, and how? If in a phenomenological perspective, as several important works on normativity, like Anthony Steinbock's and Maren Verles put it, the normal is the optimal, one could say that the optimal generative or procreative situation from a normative point of view is that of reproductive justice. The question of justice takes us, of course, at a level of analysis other than that of Husserl's description of generativity and Levinas's discussion of fecundity, even if Levinas does encounter the question of justice in other contexts. Reinserting here the question of justice, not only in the sense of the contemporary debate on reproductive justice, but also in the more classical sense in which Susan Moller-Okin elaborated her critique of roles in her 1989 book, Justice, Gender, and the Family, this means, of course, interrogating anew the frontier between supposedly infrapolitical experiences and their overt political dimension. The emphasis on procreative norms and repronormativity reflects the manner in which, in times of biopolitics, personal choices and experiences are determined not only subjectively from within, so to say, but also intersubjectively and socially in a way that encompasses that which Husserl has called personalities of higher order, institutions and legal constructions. Thus, we go beyond the genetic production and sedimentation of norms within personal or direct interpersonal experience, and we move towards the generative, historical, communal, and even intergenerational production of norms that is embedded with social political realities and institutions. Only one phrase left. By doing this, we take up and perhaps extend the task of a generative phenomenology of normality and abnormality, which, as Anthony Steinbock puts it, requires formulating and elaborating the historical, normative, and intersubjective dimensions of normality. Nonetheless, by equating the normal with the optimal and by denaturalizing it, we open up a space where the anomalous qua discordant can become normal. Thus, what was seen previously only as a discordance, as a deviance or as a modification, for instance, monoparentality or transparentality, can also function creatively as instituting new norms and dismantling the old ones, the anciently dominant ones, insofar as they were unjust and oppressive. Thank you for your patience and attention.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for your rich of reference conference, and it's full of suggestions. I think that we have 5-10 minutes to questions, suggestions. Okay, please, first, after, and third, okay? Thank you. Yes, yes.
Thank you very much, Professor, first of all, for your rich and interesting
One moment, please.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So, thank you again for your very rich and very interesting presentation. And my question is a clarificatory question on the relationship between, or maybe the boundaries between transcendental and empirical natural, because it's a very thorny issue. And my question goes as such. Could we say that a transcendental subjectivity as we are, so that is able to experience the other with the richness that is proper to our experience, and as a life world that is not a mere natural world, necessary had to be a child, had to have been a child, sorry. And so that, I mean, being a child with a need for care is like a transcendental necessary passage for the development of a subjectivity as we are, or that is a merely empirical condition, so that we may say, okay, even without being a child, even without having had a mother or a caregiver, a subject could experience the world as we do. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, which is massive, and of course you understood very well that the relationship between the transcendental and the empirical is at the background of my analysis. My response, that not everyone will agree with, is that the intersubjective, interpersonal structures of development of subjectivities do have a transcendental relevance, and I have tried to show this in other works, that Husserl progressively acknowledges the transcendental relevance of this historical becoming. It is when the phenomenology of intersubjectivity and historicity collide, then the empirical appears in a new light. But of course, this position will not be unanimously accepted. I see that very well. What I also believe is that the, so to speak, eternalist or position on subjectivity is the position that imposes itself within the realms of genetic phenomenology, and that taking up the generative standpoint modifies this claim and introduces a more developmental and a more relational perspective, which are integrated at the transcendental level. In the C manuscripts, Husserl speaks of the parental monad. It's one example among many, many others. Thank you again.
Hi, thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. The way you criticize Husserl and Levinas, and also showing that this criticism can be themselves criticized, is really impressive and valuable for me. My question is about your position on constructivism in phenomenology, because you said in your introduction that you partly but mainly agree with critical phenomenology to have this a priori of constructivism, but then you also say that you wanted to show the limits of this kind of doing phenomenology, because I was wondering, in parenthood, of course I totally agree that there is a lot of kind of parenthood and we can deconstruct and reinvent how to be parents, but there is the child, and I was wondering, in your opinion, in what way can we think of the child as something we can construct or deconstruct, and maybe the limits would be the needs of the child. So I was wondering, what do you do with these natural limits of the child's needs? And I mean, the reason of my question is also what phenomenology is able to do, because you quote Husserl saying that from one part we have to think what is experienced as something already there and rethink it, but also saying that when you say that we can, as a phenomenologist, we can bracket the norms, you also said that we can't do that. The norms are here and they are already before the bracketing determines the experience. So as a phenomenologist, how can we participate in this deconstruction, and how far?
Thank you very much, Casimir. I will begin with perhaps with the last question, which is the more vast. I think that one intention with my presentation was the emphasizing the plural genealogy of norms. So the fact that the phenomenological, the experiential, the intentional formation of norms is intertwined with another genealogy. So it's always a kind of intertwinement that cannot that cannot be separated. It's the purification. There is no possible purification here, because the question is if you ask how are such experiences possible, you will also always cross the impure genealogy. So my position is that of the intertwinement. From this point of view, I think that I stand really in the line of a Merleau-Pontian position on this issue. Well, on constructivism, you totally got my hesitation. That is, of course, that I cannot embrace as a phenomenologist and as a philosopher in general, the strong social constructivism, but I do embrace a kind of weak constructivism that goes rather in the direction of a material and historical a priori. So this is for me the path perhaps of a weak constructivism, is the historicization of the a priori and its materialization. So with this we are placed at a level that could be called quasi-transcendental, and this is, for instance, a notion that Lisa Günther uses. And this is also interesting to see with respect to the naturality objection that you raised. Well, of course, there are, and you know that, I know, because we have already discussed this topic, there are radical constructivist positions for which the vulnerability of the child is a social construction. I won't go that far, but my question was not even this one. My question was rather, okay, the child, the limits of the child. For me, it's a more hermeneutic question. How do we interpret them? So instead of saying from the outset it's natural, I think it's a conflict of interpretations and the hermeneutical plurality that we have here on the one hand. And my question is, in spite of the resolution of or the response of this conflict, who responds to them? Who is called to respond to these needs, and on what basis? What are the justifications that will assign certain positions and therefore certain experiences on the basis of this supposed naturality of the child's needs? Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions about Husserl's standpoint. Also, my first question is about the relationship between love and the instinct. So this relationship, also called continuity, is a little not very clear for me. So, for example, Husserl will say the maternal love is at the same time an instinct of mother, but shouldn't we make a distinction between instinct and love? Because sometimes Husserl's descriptions on instinct or drives give us the impression that the instinct or drive is located on relative lower level of life, or focus on the value of enjoyment, but the value in love shouldn't be equated with the value in enjoyment. So, and my second question is about, so when Husserl discusses the generative love, he will always use the example of maternal love or the love of mother, but sometimes he will also say that so he will use the term mother function and father function. So to what extent we could say that a man can take over the function of mother, or to what extent we can say that Husserl's descriptions about mother can be applied to fathers?
Thank you very much. I will respond very quickly, rather to the second point, because I think you know more than me on the first one, and I will attend your presentation tomorrow to discuss more with you and hear to you on that. It's interesting. I see exactly what is the text you are thinking about about Mutterfunktion and Vaterfunktion, and it's a text that I commented elsewhere. And I don't know, your suggestion is interesting. I didn't go as far in my reading to interpret it as a possible interchangeability, and so I have to figure out, I have to think about it. Thank you. It's a very, very rich suggestion, but it's this functional reading, it remains quite isolated direction in Husserl, but it's important and worth mentioning. Thank you very much.
Hello, Professor Serban. Thank you so much for your conference. I will try to make my question very quickly. So I was trying to just figure out which is your position about affect and emotion. I mean, because feminism theory usually actually flies around the question about affect and emotion and feelings as concepts. So I was trying to just figure out maybe this instinct doesn't function actually as an affect, this kind of pre-cultural, pre-linguistic kind of affective phenomenon. So what is your stand at this distinction that usually comes from Brian Masumi about the distinction between affect and emotion, considering that affect could be a kind of a possibility just to break the status quo in this kind of gender normed normativity? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I haven't explored in such a fine manner the distinction between affect and emotion, but affect in relationship to instinct and the grounding of affectivity in instinct, it's something that I discussed elsewhere by putting an emphasis on the idea of emotional effort and emotional work, which is required by parenthood. This is, and which is a kind of labor which is invisibilized and also gender governed by gender norms. So it is in this direction, in the direction of the emotional work, on the dimension of emotional work as a part of the care work, of the reproductive work, and also as a means for agency, in fact, as a hidden agency that I would put emphasis on. Thank you again.
Very quick, short, please. Emilio.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Just a very short question. About the instinct. Instinct, maybe it's a term that we have to put in question. Because the instinct not is something rigid, something flexible. Depend also of the social environment where you are. It's not is a law. It's another thing. And this is a phenomenon. We have to discuss about it because it is against the women.
Thank you for the question. It allows me making a small but important precision about the synonymy between, which we find in Husserl, but one can discuss it between instinct and pulsion. With the notion of pulsion places us at the level of Triebintentionalität, which can also be described independently from any biological framework as a pre-reflectiveness, as a radical pre-reflectiveness. So this can be an element of response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia, all of us. Please, one moment. We remind the two important advices.
Yeah, just to remind you, please, anybody with a PowerPoint and a pending presentation, send a PowerPoint to Agatha, please. And another thing, both symposiums today, 12:30, not in the afternoon. Okay, thank you.
Lo voy a decir en castellano también. Quienes tengan que entregar algún PowerPoint para su presentación, por favor que lo envíen a Agatha Bach. Nos pedís en la mesa si no tenéis la dirección de correo para poder gestionarlo correctamente. Y el segundo aviso, espérate que se me olvide cuál era. Ay, sí, que los simposios que hay no son esta tarde, son después del coffee break. We have now a coffee break with book presentations. Now, and after goes the two symposiums, not afternoon, at 12:30 hour. Thank you very much.